The dating culture at Christian schools is really weird. I saw this firsthand as an RA for 2 years at a Christian college in Kentucky, and I'll tell you why it's weird. You've got a bunch of students who are barely adults. Many of them weren't allowed to date in high school. And then all of a sudden, all at once, they are allowed to date, their parents are gone, and they have unlimited freedom. It's the perfect recipe for weirdness. And so the most common dating advice that I would give guys on my hall was just to chill out. Because so often at Christian colleges, or at least mine, guys were the opposite of chill when it came to romance. And here's how it would often go. So a guy would go to his New Testament class, and he'd see a really pretty girl, wouldn't talk to her at all, and within 24 hours, he would be convinced that he was in love with her. That's how it starts. So he knows nothing about her, but he's too scared to talk to her. So instead of talking to her and getting to know her, he daydreams about her and he fills in the blanks in her personality with what he wants to be true about her. What he wants her to be like, not what she's actually like. And before you know that, this girl he's dreaming about looks a lot like the girl in his New Testament class outwardly, but actually is nothing like her. Because instead of getting to know her for who she is, he's made a copy of her. He's made an idol of her in his heart. And it's sad because that real girl is so much better than the copy that he's made in his heart. And by the time he works up the courage to ask her out, sometimes, not exaggerating, years later, she probably will say no because she doesn't feel like he even knows her. And if by some miracle she does say yes, that relationship is kind of doomed from the start, because when he actually does start getting to know her, he's going to realize she's not the girl she thought he was. She's not the girl that he imagined in his mind. He'll be disappointed. Or she will realize he doesn't actually like all of her. He just likes parts of her. You know, in our text this morning, Israel does something similar to God. Instead of loving and worshiping God for who he is, they try to make God into their own image, in the image of a golden calf. It's a story about the danger of idolatry, the danger of worshiping the right God in the wrong way. But it's also a story about the grace of God, who shows mercy to us even when we deserve judgment. So I want to take a minute and just recap where we're at in the book of Exodus, because we've been kind of all over the place. And I'm going to zoom in on a few important things along the way that are going to be important this morning. So beginning in the book of Exodus, God's people, they're in slavery in Egypt. So God raises up Moses and his brother Aaron to deliver them out of slavery into a promised land. And God sends 10 miraculous plagues against Egypt. Then he leads his people out into the wilderness, and eventually they arrive at a mountain, at Mount Sinai, which is where they stay for the rest of the book of Exodus, and that's where they're going to be this morning in our text. Then in Exodus chapter 19, God begins to make a covenant with his people, an agreement with his people. He says to them in Exodus chapter 19, verse 4, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." God made the first move, right? God saved his people out of their slavery, and now he tells them that he wants to bless them even more. He wants them to be his treasured people, a holy nation. But there's a condition, isn't there? They must obey his voice and keep his covenant. Well, Israel agrees. They sign the terms and conditions. Chapter 19, verse 8. All the people answered together and said, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." So a few days later, God descends on Mount Sinai in fire and smoke, and he speaks the 10 commandments to his people. And I want to reread just the second commandment, one of the very first things God says directly to his people. Exodus chapter 20, verse 4, God says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is in the earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." After God speaks the Ten Commandments in this voice like thunder, the Israelites are terrified of God. And they beg Moses to talk to God for them because they're certain that if they face God themselves, they will die. And so Moses, he goes up the mountain to God, and God gives him additional laws. God kind of fleshes out the practical implications of the Ten Commandments. And I want to ask you, do you remember what the first of those additional commands was? What we might call the 11th commandment? Exodus chapter 20, verse 23. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. So after Moses gets all these extra laws from God, he writes them down and he reads them before the people in Exodus 24. And in verse 7, they say, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. And after that, God calls Moses and Aaron's sons and the 70 elders of Israel up Mount Sinai where they see God. They eat in his presence. And then God calls Moses to go further up the mountain. And so Moses, he goes up with just Joshua, his assistant, and he leaves Aaron in charge below. And while Moses is up on the mountain talking with God, God is giving him instructions for the tabernacle, this place where his presence is going to dwell among the people. He gives him instructions for the priests and the priestly garments. And at the end of those 40 days up there, he gives him 2 stone tablets. But now let's see what's going on down the mountain. We're in Exodus chapter 32. Let's see what the Israelites have been up to down the mountain while Moses was away. Exodus 32, verse 1. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So Aaron said to them, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. God's people messed up big time. They heard the voice of God. They heard God say, you shall not make yourselves a carved image. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. You shall not make for yourselves gods of gold. 3 times the people promised that they would obey, and then they corporately break their promise in one of the worst possible ways. Did you notice what ultimately leads them down that path to worshiping the golden calf? Like, what starts this? What sets this into motion? It's impatience. It's impatience. They're tired of waiting on Moses, and they're tired of waiting on God. Even though God's been giving them bread every single morning from heaven, they are sick of camping and they want to get to the promised land. So as soon as Moses is out of sight, they decide to take things into their own hands. They go up to Aaron, they say, up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So they've completely given up on Moses, but they have just enough sense to recognize that they can't make it into the promised land unless they have divine protection. So what's their solution? What do? Well, they tell Aaron to make them gods, to make them idols. You know, at first glance, it sounds like they're asking Aaron to make idols of false gods. And that is possible. That is one possible interpretation. You know, there were a few different Egyptian gods that were represented by bulls. So it's possible that Israel wanted to worship one or more of those Egyptian gods. But after studying this and reading how most scholars interpret this passage, I think it's actually more likely that they were asking Aaron to make them idols of the one true God. They were asking for idols of Yahweh. Well, why is that? Well, first, even though they ask for gods, plural, they seem satisfied with just the one golden calf. Second, after Aaron makes the golden calf, he says, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So clearly, the people there are associating this golden calf, this idol, and the God who represents it with the Exodus, the God who brought them out of Egypt. And then third, after Aaron makes the calf, he declares a feast to the Lord, a feast to Yahweh. And so it doesn't make sense for them to throw a feast to Yahweh if this is an idol representing a false god or an Egyptian god. So what that means is that Israel might not have technically been violating the first commandment by worshiping other gods, but they were definitely violating the second commandment. They were worshiping perhaps the right God, but in the wrong way. And maybe you think to yourself, well, that's actually not so bad, right? I mean, they weren't worshiping the Egyptian gods. At least their heart's in the right place. But before you cut them any slack here, you need to understand what they were doing when they were asking Aaron to make them idols for Yahweh. So Israel just spent 400 years in an idol-worshiping nation. Egypt was all about idol worship. Clearly, they learned a few things from Egypt. Like the Egyptians, the Israelites would have also believed that idols provided access to the God they represented. And not just access, they actually believed that idols contained the presence of that God. So when Israel demands an idol of Yahweh, do you know what they're basically saying to him? They're basically saying, God, we're tired of waiting for you, so we're going to take you by force. We're going to kidnap you. We're going to capture your presence in this idol and take it with us so that we can enter the promised land when we want to. They want to make God into a genie, a good luck charm. And it makes sense why. When they saw God on Mount Sinai, they were terrified of him. They were terrified of that God, the God of fire and smoke, the God whose voice shakes the earth, the God who answers to no one. That God is just a little bit too big, a little bit too dangerous. And so they decide to try to shrink him, to manipulate him, to domesticate him. Ultimately, they wanted to trade places with God. Instead of them obeying God, they wanted God to obey them. They wanted to make God into their image. And it just gets worse. Aaron, the same Aaron who just saw God and ate in his presence, he doesn't rebuke them. He doesn't even turn a blind eye to their idolatry. He leads the effort to make the idol. He collects their gold jewelry, and you'll remember this gold jewelry is what they plundered from the Egyptians. God gave them supernatural divine favor with the Egyptians so that the Egyptians would give up their gold jewelry. He uses this gold jewelry, which was meant to be used for the tabernacle, and he makes it into a calf, a young bull, a symbol of strength, a travel-sized God to take into the promised land. In verse 4, the people say, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Look, Israel, this is what saved you out of your slavery, this golden cow. They've turned God into a mascot. And then in verses 5 and 6, Aaron, he tries to legitimatize it all by building an altar, offering sacrifices, throwing a feast to the Lord as if God is somehow pleased by all of this. Or as if by doing these religious activities, that will somehow sanctify something that is utterly depraved. But it gets even worse. End of verse 6, it says, "And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." What does that mean, rose up to play? Were they playing patty cake, Fortnite? No. Hebrew is a really modest language, so it refers to immodest things very euphemistically. And so most scholars believe this expression, rose up to play, is actually sexual. So what's going on here? In other words, the entire nation of Israel is partying. They're getting drunk and they're giving themselves over to sexual immorality in broad daylight. And they're doing it all in the name of Yahweh, who they have just formed an image of, a golden calf. Do you understand now why this sin is so terrible? Do you understand why it might be so offensive to God after all that he has done for them by his grace and all that he has promised to do for them? Back when Jason preached on the second commandment, he said, if we're not careful, we can choose to worship the parts of God we love best and exclude the real God as he has revealed himself. So the question is, for you, for me, do you worship the true God or do you worship a God made in your image? Do you worship a Mr. Potato Head God where you can pop on the pieces of him you like and you can leave out the ones that you don't? Like, I'm just going to pop on loving and forgiving. Those sound really sweet, but, I'm just going to pass on holy and just. No thanks. I want a God who gives me comfort on demand, but not a God who demands and deserves my obedience. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that God. Well, that's not a real God. That's not the real God. That's an idol. Or maybe, do you try to control and manipulate God like the Israelites? God, I've been so obedient to you. I've read my Bible so many times. I've given so much to your kingdom. You owe this to me. Or God, I'll make you a deal. If you just answer this one prayer, then I will finally give you the obedience you're asking for in this area of my life. I'll finally give this thing over to you. If you just answer this one prayer for me, let's make a deal. Well, that's not the real God either. That's an idol. Here's the problem. If you're worshiping a God that you invented, a God that you think you can control, you're not actually worshiping the God of the Bible. And I'm saying that from personal experience. I became a Christian when I was a sophomore in high school, but I said I was a Christian and thought I was a Christian long before then. And before that point, outwardly, the pretend God that I used to worship looked a lot like the real God. But there were some key differences under the surface. I'll tell you about them. So the God of the Bible takes sin seriously. But my pretend God was actually pretty okay with sin. Like, he didn't like it, but if you just, threw out a sorry every once in a while, he'd let it go. He didn't actually expect you to make real progress against your sin. All he wanted was an occasional apology, and he was satisfied. Or here's another difference. The God of the Bible, he wants to have a real relationship with his children. He wants to have a closeness that's closer than a husband and a wife. But my pretend God was kind of more of a hang out in the background kind of guy. He was always there if I need a little one-way chat, but otherwise he kind of just stayed up in the clouds, and I stayed down here and I lived my life the way I wanted to. He had stuff to do, I had stuff to do. We kind of just minded our own business. Does my old God, does my pretend God perhaps sound like yours? The last thing that I want to do is instill doubt in a true Christian. And yet in a room of this size, I think it's really possible. There are people here who think they've been worshiping the real God their whole life, but they've never met him because they already have a pretend God of their own. A God made in their image, not the God of the Bible. A God who excuses sin, or on the other hand, perhaps a God that never forgives sin. Your pretend God might be giving you way too much slack, but your pretend God perhaps is also way harsher than the God of the Bible, way less forgiving, way less loving. Well, let me tell you one more difference between the God of the Bible and my pretend God. The God of the Bible is real. He's real, and he's really with me. Like, I know him. I've seen him at work in my life every day since I met him as a sophomore in high school. But my pretend God wasn't there. And when I actually needed him the most, I was alone. Because when you worship an idol, when you substitute God for a pretend God, you're all alone. You want to hear something interesting? There's a Sumero-Akkadian prayer, a pagan prayer that was written right around the same time as Moses, a prayer to an idol. I want to read it for you. Here's what this prayer says. It says, "The God whom I know or do not know has placed suffering upon me. Although I am looking constantly for help, no one takes me by the hand. When I weep, they do not come to my side. I utter laments, but no one hears me." Is that like the most depressing thing you've ever heard? Thousands of years later, I think that prayer pretty well sums up what it's like to worship a pretend God, an idol. It's lonely. No one's actually there for you. That pretend God is fine when life is really good, but when you lose your job, when your son or your daughter goes astray, or when that routine screening comes back positive, that pretend God's no longer there for you. He can't help you. And so the question you have to consider is this: Would you rather have a real God who demands and deserves real obedience, but is really there for you? Or a pretend God who demands nothing, but can give you nothing? Which God would you rather serve? Well, we've met the fake God. Now let's see how the real God responds to all of this. Verse 7. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now, therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you.'" Down the mountain Israel, they think they're worshiping God through their idolatry and immorality, but they're not. They're mocking him. And he's right to be angry with them. And he's so angry with them, he calls them your people. He says, "Moses, these are your people. I'm not calling them my people because they've broken their side of the covenant. They've broken their promises. They're not living like the holy nation that God called them to be. It's only been weeks since they received the law, and they are already acting like every other nation around them." Did you notice what God calls them in verse 9? This is kind of funny. God calls them a stiff-necked people, and this isn't the last time he's going to call them that. What does that term mean? It means stubborn, hard-hearted, unwilling to obey. But do you know what this term would most often be applied to? Cows. Oxen that refuse to lower their heads to receive a yoke. That's where the term comes from. Isn't it interesting that God applies a term typically used for rebellious cows to his people who just worshiped a golden cow? That's not accidental, and it's not the last time. Later in this passage, the people are described as having broken loose. They're compared to a bunch of cows that have escaped their enclosure and are just running wild. What's the point here? Why is God intentionally using this cow language with his people who are worshiping a cow? Well, the point here, we see this throughout the Bible, is that you become like what you worship. You become like what you worship. If you worship an idol, you become like that idol. See this in Psalm 114. I'll read it for you. Psalm 114, verse 4 says, "Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands." Then in verse 8, "Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them." The Israelites have worshiped a cow, and as a result, they've become like cows, stiff-necked and running wild. And the same is true for you and me when we give ourselves over to idolatry. We are made to worship God. So when we worship anything other than God, whether that's a pretend copy of God, of the real God, or it's just a different God altogether, like money or career or reputation, when you worship an idol, you become less human. You become less human. It's like that idol robs you of a little bit of your humanity. It devolves you into something closer to an animal than a man or a woman. It doesn't just hurt you either. It hurts the God who made you to worship him. And when you worship anything other than God, you deserve judgment, just like Israel. Look at verse 10. What does God say to Moses? "Let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you." God's basically saying to Moses, "Moses, step aside, stand aside, and let me wipe these people out so that we can start over. I made a nation out of Abraham. His old age was no problem for me. I can make a great nation out of you. I can multiply your offspring. We can do this whole thing through you, and your descendants can enter into the promised land." That's what God is offering Moses here. And he would have been perfectly justified if he had done that. But he didn't do that. He doesn't do that. And I don't think he ultimately intended to do that because of three words near the beginning of verse 10. "Let me alone." In other words, step aside. If God's sovereign plan was to wipe out Israel then and there, would he have consulted with Moses first? Would he have said to Moses, "Hey, stand aside"? No, he would have just done it. God is testing Moses. He's testing Moses to see how he will respond. But before we see how Moses responds, take a second and ask yourself, how would you want to respond if you were Moses? And bear in mind the history of what's happened here between the people and Moses, right? These people, from day one, they have doubted you and insulted you. At one point, they almost try to kill him. They're plotting his murder. And now, you have an opportunity to be free from them. God's giving you a free chance to be free of these people, right? Bye-bye, Israelites. Done with your complaining, leading hundreds of thousands of people through the wilderness. It could be just Moses and his family taking a nice little road trip through the wilderness. It'd be so much easier, so much more manageable. Tell me you wouldn't be tempted to tell God to just go for it. That's not what Moses does. Look at verse 11. Look how he responds. But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of, bringing on his people. Notice that Moses, he doesn't try to manipulate God like the Israelites were trying to do through the idol. Moses just humbly implores God. He begs him. And do you notice what Moses is most concerned with when he asks God to spare the people? He doesn't make excuses for their sin. He doesn't try to argue that they're really, really holy, I promise, but they just got a little distracted down there. No, the thing that he's most concerned with is actually what we should be most concerned with, and that is God's glory. Did you catch that? Moses says, basically he says, God, if you kill your people now, if you wipe them out, your name will be mocked by your enemies. You'll lose that glory that you gained through the Exodus over the Egyptians. Don't let these people's sin rob you of the glory that is due your name. Moses cares about God's glory. And after that, in verse 13, Moses calls on God to remember his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he's turning down God's offer. He's saying, I don't want to be a new Abraham, God. That's not me. I want you to fulfill your promise that you made to Abraham. Through this people, as sinful as they are, I want these people to enter the promised land as you promised they would. Do you know what Moses is doing for the people here? He's interceding for them. That's what Moses is doing right now. He's interceding for them. Like you have a holy and a righteous God on one side, and you've got a stiff-necked, rebellious, idolatrous nation on the other. And Moses, he just steps right in the middle of them and pleads with God to show them mercy for the sake of his glory and for the sake of his promises. That's what an intercessor does. And what does God do? God listens. God listens. And even though he had every right and reason to wipe out the Israelites then and there, he relents because he is merciful and gracious. We'll come back to this whole intercession thing in a little bit because this isn't the last time Moses is going to intercede for Israel in this story. But for now, the Israelites, they've been spared from God's judgment, but Moses still needs to break up the party. So let's keep reading, starting in verse 15. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets that were written on both sides. On the front and on the back they were written. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, there is a noise of war in the camp. But he said, it is not the sound of shouting for victory or the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear. And as soon as he came near to the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. And Moses said to Aaron, "What did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them?" And Aaron said, "Let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, 'Make us gods who shall go before us.' As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So I said to them, 'Let any who have gold take it off.' So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." And when Moses saw that the people had broken loose, for Aaron had let them break loose to the derision of their enemies, then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered around him, and he said to them, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp, and each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor." And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses. And that day about 3,000 men of the people fell. And Moses said, "Today you have been ordained for the service of the Lord, each one at the cost of his son and of his brother, so that he might bestow a blessing upon you this day." So Moses and Joshua, they head down the mountain, and the people are still singing and dancing around this false idol of Yahweh. So what does Moses do? Well, in front of everybody, and probably right in front of the calf, Moses takes these 2 tablets written by God, and he shatters them into pieces. You know, Moses kind of has a bit of a track record for throwing temper tantrums, but I actually don't think that's what's going on here. I don't think Moses just lost his cool. I think this was righteous, controlled anger. He didn't break the tablets because he just flipped out. He broke the tablets to symbolize how Israel has broken the covenant. That's why he did it. And after that, he deals with the idol. He burns it, he grinds it into powder, he scatters it over the water, and then he forces the people to drink it. You know, I've been wondering for weeks as I've been thinking about this passage, why does he make them drink it? Like, what's up with that? After studying it, I'm still not sure, but I think there's just some humor, some ironic justice in the fact that the Israelites went from worshiping a golden calf to drinking their golden calf, and then within a few days, to defecating their gold calf. There's some irony there. Or maybe Moses is saying to the people, if you don't consume your idols will consume you. So after he takes care of the idol, he confronts Aaron, and Aaron's excuses, as you heard, are pretty pathetic. Verse 24, Aaron, "So I said to the people, 'Let any who have gold take it off.' So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." You won't believe it, Moses. A bunch of jewelry, I threw it in, and bam, out came this golden cow. Isn't that crazy? Clearly, Aaron is not going to take charge of the situation, so Moses steps up, and in verse 26, he summons the people to him. He says, "Who's on the Lord's side? Come to me." And then he tells all the Levite men who come out, and they say, "The Lord God of Israel says, put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp, and each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor." And it says that about 3,000 men are killed. So what's going on here? What's going on here? Well, first, we need to remember that there's still a nationwide party going on. Throughout the entire camp of Israel, people are getting drunk and giving themselves over to all kinds of depravity. And so Moses, speaking for God, he commands the Levites to put a stop to it, to put an end to it. And it costs 3,000 men their lives. This idolatry threatened their entire nation. It almost cost the entire nation their lives. God was ready to wipe the people out. It was like a cancer that needed to be cut out, and it came at the cost of 3,000 lives. But maybe you're wondering, why these particular 3,000 men? Well, the text doesn't tell us exactly, but I don't think it was random. I don't think it was random. Many scholars make the guess that as the Levites were going through the camp, breaking up the party, they only took the lives of those who refused to stop or stood in their way. Remember that there are hundreds of thousands of Israelites. 3,000 is a big number, but relative to the number of Israelites out there, it's not as big of a number as you might think. 3,000 died so that hundreds of thousands would wake up and realize how much sin they were in, how depraved what they were doing was. Now let's read to the end of the chapter, and we're going to see what happens the next day, starting in verse 30. The next day Moses said to the people, "You have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." So Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written." But the Lord said to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But now go, lead the people to the place about which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them." Then the Lord sent a plague on the people because they made the calf, the one that Aaron made. Moses convinced God to turn away from his wrath up on Mount Sinai. Now he's destroyed the idol. He's put a stop to the party, but he recognizes that their sin is still unpaid. It still requires atonement. Making the people drink their idol and executing a small percentage of the population, that might have been enough to temporarily stop the idolatry, but Moses knew they still deserve far, far greater judgment for what they've done. So he takes the initiative and he intercedes one more time. He returns to God, and look at what he says to him in verse 32. Moses says to God, "If you will forgive their sin," then it's like he pauses in the thought, and he says, "But if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written." Back on Mount Sinai, Moses begged God not to judge the people. But now, if God won't forgive the people, Moses begs God to judge him instead of the people, to blot Moses' name out of the book instead of the names of the Israelites. Well, what's this book that Moses is talking about, that God is talking about? Well, this is a time when kings would keep lists of their citizens in a book, and every time a citizen died, their name would be blotted out of the book. It represented life and death. So Moses is saying, God, if your wrath has to be poured out on anyone, pour it out on me. Take my life and spare these people. That tells us that Moses is starting to understand what God's trying to teach his people through the sacrificial system. He's trying to teach his people that guilt can only be pardoned, sin can only be pardoned through the blood of an innocent intercessor. That's how you get rid of sin. You need an innocent intercessor who's willing to lay down their life. So Moses is laying himself down on the altar like a sacrificial lamb. Take my life instead of these guilty, sinful people. In this story, we're not like Moses. In this story, we are like sinful, idolatrous Israel. We are hopelessly enslaved to our false gods. We need a Moses. We need someone who hasn't been corrupted by our idolatry, someone who is willing to intercede for us to turn away the wrath of God that we deserve, even at the cost of his own life. And that intercessor came hundreds of years later, a new and a better intercessor named Jesus. A man who wasn't corrupted by sin, a man who wasn't corrupted by idolatry, a man who always worshiped the right God in the right way, a man who was willing, able, delighted to stand before God and turn away the wrath of God that we deserved. But how did he do it? How did Jesus turn away the wrath of God? Well, he did it by dying. He did it by taking God's wrath on himself. He was nailed to a cross to be our substitute, to take the judgment that you and I deserve. And when he rose from the grave, he proved that that payment was accepted by God, that justice was satisfied. Jesus is the true and better Moses who rescues us from our idols. And you need to know that if you put your faith in him today, if you haven't already, you too will be forgiven of your sin. And you too will be rescued from your idols. It's good news that Jesus came because Moses wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. His heart was in the right place, but he could never be the perfect sacrificial lamb like Jesus because he wasn't perfect. He himself was a sinner. Moses was a sinner too, and a sinner can't die for another sinner. And that's why God doesn't accept his offer. God doesn't accept the offer. God tells him that those who sinned against him, their names will still be blotted out of his book. We don't know exactly what that refers to. That might refer to the plague that God sends at the end of the chapter. It might be referring to how this entire generation is going to die in the wilderness before they enter the promised land because of their unbelief. But either way, the people who sinned against God, the people who worshiped that golden calf, they eventually face judgment for what they did. Isn't it awesome news that in Christ, we're never going to face judgment for our sin? Like through Christ, we don't have to worry that one day it's all going to come back and get us. That we're going to face God and he's going to say, sorry, sin one too many times, this one's on you. No. Jesus was the perfect sacrifice. He did pay the price for idolatry, and now we are free. We are free. So church, as we close, how should we live in light of this truth? First, we should live every day striving to worship the right God in the right way, the true God of the Bible. Second, we should seek to know and love God for who he truly is, not who we selfishly want him to be, not who we might prefer him to be. We need to worship him as he actually is, as he is revealed in his word. And third, when we recognize idols in our lives, when we spot ways that we're worshiping a false god or a pretend god or a god of our own choosing, we should run confidently to Christ, who forgives us and frees us from our idolatry. Let's pray.